The limousine stopped without warning. Marcus Webb had been asleep under the overhang of a glass office tower on North Michigan Avenue, his body folded into the shallow warmth between a heating vent and a concrete pillar. When the sharp squeal of brakes cut through the gray morning air, he did not startle. After 8 years on the streets of Chicago, he had learned to surface from sleep slowly the way a man surfaces from deep water, careful not to break too much of the surface at once. He opened his eyes to a pale December sky, 7 degrees, the kind of cold that did not announce itself but simply arrived, settling into joints and lungs like an old debt. He heard a car door open. He heard heels on pavement, a precise, unhurried sound, the sound of someone who had never once questioned whether the ground beneath her feet was solid. He pulled the sleeping bag tighter and looked up. The woman standing on the sidewalk was not looking at him. She was looking at his chest. Margaret Calloway was 57 years old and had not wept in public since the morning she identified her son's body in a Cook County morgue 8 years prior. She had built Calloway Urban Systems from a $40,000 line of credit and a rented desk in a shared office space in Wicker Park. She had negotiated infrastructure contracts with mayors and governors, had testified before Senate subcommittees, had laid off 300 people in a single afternoon when the numbers required it, and had not allowed herself to feel anything about it until she was in her car with the partition raised. She had always believed that discipline was the only honest response to a world that rewarded nothing else. She was standing on North Michigan Avenue in 7-degree weather without her coat because she could not remember taking a step toward the car door. The necklace, a small steel pendant on a thin chain, resting against the man's collarbone above the collar of his jacket. The pendant itself was unremarkable to anyone who had not made it a flat oval, no larger than a thumbnail, engraved with a single initial on one side. What no one else would notice, what only Margaret Calloway could possibly know, was the hairline fracture running diagonally from the upper left corner to the lower right. She had made that fracture herself, 23 years ago, when she knocked it off the bathroom counter on the morning of Daniel's 14th birthday. She had driven to 3 jewelers before finding one who could engrave the replacement the same day. She had given it to him at dinner that evening, and he had put it on immediately and never taken it off. She had buried him without it, because they never found it in the tunnel. The man on the sidewalk was now fully awake. He sat up slowly, one hand rising to cover the pendant, not aggressively, but with the quiet instinct of someone protecting something that had been taken from him before. He looked at her without speaking. His face was broad and weathered, his eyes dark and very still. Margaret said, "Where did you get that?" It was not a question. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Daniel gave it to me," before he went back in. Margaret Calloway had last seen her son 3 weeks before the fire. He had come to her office on a Tuesday afternoon without an appointment, which was the only way he ever came anywhere. Daniel had inherited his father's belief that showing up unannounced was a form of honesty. He had carried a manila folder and set it on her desk without sitting down. Inside was a technical report, printed on plain paper, with passages underlined in red ink. "The fire suppression material in the central equipment bays," he had said. "It has been substituted. The specs call for Class A. What is installed is Class C. I have seen the delivery manifests." Margaret had looked at the report. She had not picked it up. "Where did you get this?" she had asked. "Marcus Webb, the safety engineer on the East River project. He would not sign the acceptance report. He sent me a copy because he did not trust internal review." She had looked at her son, 29 years old, wearing a jacket that needed dry cleaning, hair he kept meaning to cut. He had his father's jaw and his father's certainty, and she had spent the better part of a decade watching that certainty collide with the practical realities of running a company that employed 11,000 people. "Daniel," she had said, "you are not an engineer. There are certification processes. There are sign-offs. If there were a genuine safety deficiency, it would have been flagged through the proper channels." Webb flagged it through the proper channels. He was told to resubmit. Then, he can resubmit. Daniel had picked up the folder without a word and walked out of her office. That was the last real conversation they had. 4 days later, she signed a budget reduction package that her younger brother Raymond, chief operating officer of Calloway Urban Systems, had placed in her afternoon stack. 14 pages of line items, Aggregate savings of $4.2 million across 7 active projects. She initialed each page. She did not read the distribution breakdown. She never read the distribution breakdown. That was what Raymond was for. 18 days after that, a fire started in the central equipment bay of the East River Tunnel at 11:47 in the evening. The suppression system activated and failed within 90 seconds. 8 people died. One man, the safety engineer, Marcus Webb, was listed as having fled the scene. Margaret spent 8 years believing that. She did not call the police. She told her driver to wait, led Marcus Webb 2 blocks to a private medical clinic she kept on retainer for executive travel emergencies, and sat in the hallway while a physician she had never met examined a man she had never seen before that morning. When the doctor came out 40 minutes later, he was carrying a printed summary and looking at her with an expression she recognized as professional neutrality over something more complicated. Burns, fully healed, consistent with prolonged heat exposure and partial thickness injury, he said. Cranial imaging shows evidence of prior traumatic brain injury, moderate severity, likely untreated for an extended period. He has episodic memory disruption consistent with the injury pattern. Whoever this man is, he was not well when he got hurt. Margaret took the summary. She sat for another 10 minutes in the hallway, looking at nothing in particular. Then she took out her phone and called Claire Novak. Claire was 44, a former investigator with the Illinois State Police who now ran a 2-person firm out of a 4th-floor office in Lincoln Park. Margaret had used her twice before, once to investigate a subcontractor fraud, once for something she did not discuss. Claire answered on the second ring. "I need you to pull the East River Tunnel file," Margaret said. "The original investigation, everything that was sealed, after the final report." A pause. "That file has been closed for 8 years. "I know." "Margaret." "Claire, the safety engineer is alive. He is sitting 10 feet away from me in a medical clinic on Erie Street. I need to know what actually happened." Another pause, longer this time. "I will make some calls," Claire said. Margaret put the phone in her pocket and went back into the examination room. Marcus Webb was sitting on the edge of the table, jacket back on, fingers folded in his lap. He was looking at the wall with the expression of a man who had spent a great deal of time looking at walls. "I know you have no reason to trust me," Margaret said. She sat down in the chair beside the table. "I also know that the official record says you ran. I do not believe that anymore. But I need you to tell me everything you remember about the night of the fire, all of it, even the pieces that do not connect." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Daniel pulled me out of Bay 7, he said. The ceiling had already started to go. He grabbed my jacket and pulled me, and I could not get my feet under me for about 10 seconds. When I could stand, he took the necklace off and put it in my hand. He said there were 4 more people in the inner bay. He said, 'Keep this.'" Marcus paused. Then he went back in. Margaret sat very still. "I lost consciousness sometime after that. I do not know how long I was on the ground before someone found me. I woke up in a hospital and did not know my own name for 3 days." Margaret looked at the pendant, still hanging around his neck. She had spent 8 years believing the man who let her son die was somewhere else, living under a different name, having made a calculation and walked away. She had spent 8 years being certain about that. "We are going to find out what happened," she said. It was not a comfort. It was a statement of intent, the way she had always made statements without asking whether the person in front of her was ready to hear it. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Does finding out change anything?" he asked. Margaret did not answer, because she did not yet know, and she had never been willing to lie to fill a silence. The first thing Claire Novak found took her less than 48 hours. She called Margaret on a Thursday morning, her voice carrying the particular flatness it took on when she was delivering information she had not yet decided how to feel about. Margaret was in the back of her car, 3 blocks from the clinic, having spent the previous night in a hotel room rather than her Lincoln Park townhouse, because she did not want to be somewhere familiar while she was thinking. "Cook County Hospital," Claire said. "Admission record, November 14th, 8 years ago. Patient listed as John Webb, no known address. Admitted at 12:52 in the morning with 2nd-degree burns to the forearms and neck, blunt cranial trauma, and smoke inhalation. He was transferred to a recovery ward 4 months later and discharged with no identification documents on file. Margaret looked out the window. The city moved past in its usual way, indifferent. The fire started at 11:47, she said. Correct. Marcus Webb was unconscious in a Cook County emergency room 53 minutes after the fire started. He could not have fled the scene. He was the scene. There was a silence. Someone knew he was there, Margaret said. Someone knew he was there, had access to the hospital intake records, and made sure his name did not appear in any document connected to the investigation. The intake form was filed under a variant of his name that would not surface in a standard database cross-reference. That is not an accident. That takes a deliberate effort by someone who understood both the medical system and the investigative process. And Margaret, someone who also calculated that a man with no memory, no identification, and no one looking for him would never be able to contradict the official record. Margaret thought about Raymond. She had been thinking about Raymond for 2 days in the careful, contained way she approached problems she was not yet ready to fully open. What about the acceptance report, she said. The one with his signature. Still working on that. I have a forensic document analyst looking at the signature block. I should have something by the weekend. Margaret ended the call and told her driver to take her back to the clinic. That evening, she sat across from Marcus Webb in the small room he had been given at the back of the clinic, a storage room converted to a recovery space, barely large enough for a cot and a chair, but warm, which was the only quality that mattered to a man who had spent the previous night in 7-degree weather. He was eating soup from a paper container. He did not stop eating when she came in, which she appreciated. She set Claire's preliminary report on the cot beside him. You were in Cook County Hospital the night of the fire, she said, admitted 53 minutes after the blaze started. You were never missing. You were never running. Someone filed your intake under a name that would not connect you to the investigation, and then let the official record call you a fugitive. Marcus put down the soup. He looked at the report without picking it up. I knew I did not run, he said, quietly. I know. I have known that for 8 years. That was the part I was always sure of, even when everything else was gone. He looked up at her. Do you understand what it is like to know one true thing about yourself and have no way to prove it to anyone? Margaret held his gaze. Tell me about the acceptance report, she said. Before the fire, the one you refused to sign. Marcus was quiet for a moment, organizing something. His memory, she had come to understand, did not function in sequence. It came in fragments, some vivid and some entirely absent, and he had learned over the years to present them carefully rather than in the order they appeared. I flagged the fire suppression material in early October, he said. Bay 7 through Bay 12, the central equipment corridor. The original spec called for a Class A intumescent compound. It expands under heat, seals gaps, slows structural ignition. What was installed was a Class C polymer, cheaper, lighter, adequate for low-risk above-ground applications, not adequate for a tunnel with high electrical load and limited ventilation. Who did you report it to? My direct supervisor first. He told me to resubmit the concern through the materials compliance portal. I did that. 2 weeks later, I received a notification that the concern had been reviewed and the installation had been certified as meeting project specifications by the lead contractor. He paused. The certification was signed by a contractor representative I had never met and whose name did not appear anywhere else in the project documentation. So the internal process produced a result that allowed the project to continue. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I did not believe the certification. I pulled the original delivery manifests myself. I still had access at that point and confirmed that Class C material had been delivered to the site in quantities consistent with a full installation. I documented everything and sent it to Daniel because he had come to a site walk 2 months earlier and asked questions that suggested he understood what he was looking at. Margaret absorbed this. Daniel came to the site. He came twice. He was not on the official visitor log the second time. Marcus paused. He told me he had raised concerns internally and been told they had been addressed. He wanted to see the installation himself. He came to the tunnel the night of the fire to get the original documents, she said, before they were destroyed. He called me at 9 that evening. He said he had copies of the delivery manifests and the original spec sheets, but he needed the physical site inspection log, the one I had kept in the engineering office, inside the tunnel, because I did not trust leaving it in the main building. He was coming to get it before the final project inspection the following morning, and you were both there when the fire started. I was in the engineering office when the alarm went off. The door jammed, the heat had already warped the frame. Daniel got it open from the outside. Marcus stopped for a moment. He could have left. He had the documents. He had what he came for. He went back in because he could hear the other crew calling. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the clinic hallway, a door opened and closed. Margaret said, "I signed the budget reduction that made the substitution possible." "I know," Marcus said. "I did not read the line item allocation. I never read the line item allocation. Raymond handled the operational distribution, and I trusted that, because trusting that made everything run faster." She did not look away from him. "I am not telling you this to ask for anything. I am telling you because you are the only person in the world who was actually there, and you deserve to know every part of what I understand about how it happened." Marcus looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Your brother, Raymond, he knew the material was substandard?" "I do not know yet. Claire is still working on the document chain." She paused. "But I intend to find out." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, not quite trust, but the absence of the particular guardedness he had been carrying since the morning on Michigan Avenue. He reached into the collar of his jacket and lifted the necklace over his head. He held it in both hands, looking at it. "Daniel told me to keep it," he said. "I took that seriously. For 8 years, that was the one thing I had that told me I had not imagined everything." "You did not imagine anything," Margaret said. He nodded, once. Then he put the necklace back on. Claire delivered the document analysis on Saturday morning. The signature on the acceptance report, the one that bore Marcus Webb's name and had been used for 8 years as evidence that he had signed off on a deficient system, had been produced by tracing a digitized copy of his authentic signature from an earlier project document and reproducing it at a print resolution that would pass visual inspection but showed inconsistent ink pressure under forensic examination. It was not sophisticated forgery. It was the kind of forgery produced by someone who had been confident the document would never be closely examined. Margaret read the full report at the kitchen table of her hotel suite, coffee going cold beside her. She set it down and sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the table, long enough to feel, fully and without management, the weight of what she was holding. Then she picked up her phone and called Raymond. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been expecting her call. "We should talk in person," he said. "Yes," said Margaret. "We should." They met that afternoon in the conference room of Raymond's attorney's office, in the loop a detail that told Margaret everything she needed to know about how he had been preparing for this conversation. Raymond was 62, silver-haired, with the easy confidence of a man who had spent 4 decades making himself indispensable to people with more ambition than patience for operational detail. He had run Callaway Urban Systems' day-to-day operations for 19 years. He knew where every number came from. He did not deny substituting the material. "It was within the contractor's certified performance range," he said. "I made a resource allocation decision within the authority your budget approval gave me. That is not malfeasance, Margaret. That is operations management. You had Marcus Webb's signature forged on the acceptance report." A pause. His attorney touched his arm briefly. "I had a documentation irregularity corrected," Raymond said carefully. Webb had refused to submit a compliant report despite the material having received third-party certification. His refusal was an administrative obstruction. The project had a completion deadline. 8 people died, Raymond. 8 people died in a fire whose cause was investigated and adjudicated. The investigation concluded. The investigation concluded what you arranged for it to conclude. Margaret set Claire's forensic report on the table between them. She set the hospital admission record beside it. She set the recovered email chain retrieved from a backup server Raymond had apparently not known existed on top of both. Raymond looked at the documents. His attorney leaned forward and began reading. "You had him admitted under a false name," Margaret said. "You knew he was in that hospital. You let the official record call him a fugitive for 8 years, while he was sleeping on the street without identification because you had made sure there was no record of who he was. I had no involvement in the hospital intake process. The intake form was filed by a site supervisor who reported directly to you, using a name variation that appears in an email you sent the morning after the fire. She kept her voice level. I am not here to negotiate. I am telling you what I have and what I intend to do with it. I thought you deserved to know that before you read it in the news. Raymond looked at her across the table. For a moment, she saw something beneath the confidence, not remorse. Exactly, but the expression of a man recalibrating under changed conditions. If you proceed with this, he said, halcyon walks. The sale collapses. 11,000 employees. Pension fund. 20-year employees who have nothing else. I know. You could lose everything. I understand that, his attorney said, carefully. Mrs. Calloway, perhaps we should. I am done, Margaret said. She picked up her copies of the documents, set the originals on the table, and stood. I came as a courtesy, not for permission. She was at the door when Raymond said, You signed the approval, Margaret. Whatever happens to me, your name is on that page. She stopped. She did not turn around. Yes, she said, it is. Then she left. The leak reached a reporter at the Chicago Tribune 48 hours later, a courier envelope, no return address, containing a curated selection of documents, the forged acceptance report, Marcus Webb's employment record, and a timeline that presented him as the sole architect of the failure and the fire. The story ran the following morning. Marcus Webb's 8-year-old identification photograph appeared on the front page of the Tribune's digital edition beneath a headline that used the words fugitive and accountability in close proximity. Marcus read it on a nurse's phone. He did not say anything to anyone at the clinic. He folded his jacket, placed the necklace carefully on the pillow, and walked out through the clinic's side entrance into the cold. By the time Margaret arrived that morning, the room was empty except for the necklace and the thin impression his weight had left in the cot's thin mattress. Margaret picked up the necklace. She stood in the empty room for a long time. Then her phone rang. It was the chairman of her board, informing her that the board had voted, in an emergency session held the previous evening, to suspend her executive authority pending a review of her recent management decisions. The language was careful and bureaucratic, and meant exactly one thing. She was alone. She put the phone in her pocket. She held the necklace in her closed fist. For the first time in 8 years, she did not know what the next step was. For the first time in 8 years, she let herself not know. Claire found him in 3 days. She called Margaret on a Tuesday evening, the sky outside already dark at 4:30 in the way Chicago skies went dark in December, not gradually but all at once, as if someone had simply decided. Margaret was sitting in her hotel suite with the necklace on the table in front of her and a glass of water she had not touched. Southeast side, Claire said. There is a memorial installation near Pullman outdoor, year-round. Community project. They put up wooden markers for people who died on the streets without family to claim them. He goes there. One of the volunteers recognized the description. Is he all right? A pause that answered the question before the words did. He is outside. It is 18 degrees tonight. Margaret was in her car 12 minutes later. The memorial was a narrow strip of ground between a chain-link fence and a community garden that had gone dormant for winter. Someone had strung low solar lights along the path, and they glowed a dim amber in the darkness, illuminating rows of wooden markers driven into the frozen ground. Some had names, some had only dates, some had neither, just a marker, standing in the cold, saying that someone had been there. Marcus was sitting on a low wooden bench at the far end of the path, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at a marker near his feet. He did not turn when Margaret approached. She did not announce herself. She simply walked to the bench and sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The cold was the kind that required conscious management. She could feel it working at the exposed skin of her face and hands, patient and thorough. She looked at the marker nearest the bench. No name. A date from 6 winters ago. I used to think about what his marker would look like, Marcus said, without preamble. If I had died in that tunnel and no one had found me in time, no name, no record, just a date. He paused. Turns out that is almost exactly what happened. just took 8 years instead of 8 minutes. Margaret did not offer a correction. What he was describing was true. She reached into her coat pocket and set the necklace on the bench between them. He looked at it, but did not touch it. "I signed the budget reduction," she said. "I initialed 14 pages of line items, and I did not read the distribution breakdown because I trusted that Raymond would make responsible decisions within the parameters I set. That was not ignorance. That was a choice I made every day for years to not look closely at things I had decided someone else was responsible for." She stopped. The cold air made the words feel more deliberate than she intended, each one visible for a moment before it disappeared. "Daniel came to my office 3 weeks before the fire. He put a report on my desk. I told him he was not an engineer, and I put it down without picking it up." Marcus was very still. "I am not telling you this to explain myself," Margaret continued. "I have spent 8 years explaining myself, privately, in every formulation that allows me to remain the person I believe I am. I am telling you because you were in that tunnel. You were the one person who tried to stop what happened through the correct channels, and were systematically prevented from doing so. And then you were erased. And then the record called you responsible." She looked at him directly. "You are the only person I owe the complete truth to. So that is what I am giving you." Marcus was quiet for a long time. The solar lights along the path flickered once in a gust of wind, and then steadied. "I used to be angry," he said finally. "For the first few years, when I could remember enough to be angry, I was. Then the anger got too heavy to carry around without a place to put it. So I put it down." He looked at the necklace. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to give everything I have to the Cook County State's attorney." The forged signature, the email chain, the hospital intake record, the materials documentation, all of it, including the budget approval with my signature on it. That could mean charges against you. Possibly civil liability. I do not know about criminal. My attorney thinks the distinction between negligent oversight and willful misconduct will be contested. She paused. "I want to be honest with you. I cannot promise this ends cleanly. For either of us, Raymond has resources, and he will use them. The company may not survive the investigation intact. There are 11,000 employees whose situations I cannot fully protect." Marcus turned to look at her for the first time since she had sat down. "You are asking me something," he said. "No," Margaret said. "I am not asking for permission. I decided before I came here." She held his gaze. "I came because you deserve to know what is about to happen before it happens. You have spent 8 years having things done to you without warning. I will not be one more person who does that." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the markers. "Daniel talked about you," he said. "The night he called me, he said his mother had built something real, something that mattered, and that he did not think she understood yet that protecting it meant protecting the people inside it, not just the structure." He paused. He was not angry when he said it. He said it like someone who had thought about it for a long time and had not given up. Margaret looked straight ahead. The solar lights cast long shadows across the frozen ground. "He was right," she said, "and I was not ready to hear it." She stood. She buttoned her coat. She looked down at the necklace on the bench between them and left it there. "Come back to the clinic," she said. "It is 18 degrees, and what comes next is going to require you to be somewhere with an address." Marcus looked at the necklace. Then he picked it up, held it for a moment, and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood. He did not say yes. He simply stood, and they walked back along the path together, past the rows of markers with their amber light, past the names and the nameless, out through the gate and into the waiting car. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning on the 3rd Thursday of December. Margaret had not slept the previous night in the way that felt like a choice, rather than a failure. She had lain in the dark and reviewed what she knew and what she intended to say, and had found, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that she was no longer afraid of the meeting itself. She was afraid of many things. The meeting was not one of them. The boardroom occupied the northeast corner of the 41st floor of the Callaway building. 23 people were present. The full board, 4 representatives from Halcyon Capital who had flown in from New York, the company's outside legal counsel, and, in the back row, Raymond's attorney and two men Margaret did not recognize, but whose posture identified them as additional representation. Raymond himself sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, watching her enter. She set her portfolio on the table and remained standing. The board chairman, a 70-year-old former infrastructure secretary named Gerald Marsh, who had known Margaret for 22 years, looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression that communicated both personal regard and professional apprehension. "Margaret," he said, "before we begin, I want to note for the record that the board's position remains that a brief continuance of the Halcyon transaction would be in the best." "Gerald," she said, "I need you to let me speak first." He stopped. He nodded. She opened the portfolio. She removed a single bound document, 41 pages, prepared with Claire's help over the previous 72 hours, and set one copy in front of Gerald Marsh. "What I am about to do," she said, "is terminate the Halcyon transaction effective immediately, tender my resignation as Chief Executive Officer effective at the close of this meeting, and transfer the complete evidentiary file I have assembled, including documentation of my own decision-making in the period preceding the East River Tunnel fire, to the office of the Cook County State's Attorney, with whom I have a meeting this afternoon." The room was very still. One of the Halcyon representatives began to say something. Margaret continued without acknowledging him. 8 years ago, 8 people died in a fire in the East River Tunnel. The official investigation concluded that the failure was caused by a safety engineer named Marcus Webb, who was found to have approved a deficient suppression system and subsequently fled. That conclusion was false. Marcus Webb refused to approve the deficient system. His signature on the acceptance report was forged. He was in a Cook County emergency room 53 minutes after the fire started, admitted under a false name by a site supervisor acting on instructions that originated in this building. She looked at Raymond. Raymond Calloway directed the substitution of substandard fire suppression material in the East River Tunnel, directed the falsification of the acceptance report when the legitimate safety engineer refused to sign it, and directed the suppression of Marcus Webb's identity in the subsequent investigation. The documentation supporting each of these conclusions is in the report in front of you. Raymond's attorney was on his feet. "Mrs. Calloway, I must advise you that these are serious allegations, and they are documented conclusions," Margaret said. "There is a difference." She turned back to Gerald Marsh, who was reading the first page of the report with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what he was holding. "I want to be precise about my own role," Margaret said. "I signed the budget reduction that made the material substitution possible. I did not direct the substitution. I did not know the specific allocation, but I created the conditions under which that decision could be made without scrutiny, and I dismissed my son's concerns 3 weeks before the fire because I believed my operational structure was more reliable than his judgment. I do not consider myself without responsibility. I am prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation into my own conduct." She paused. "I am not asking for the board's approval of this decision. I am informing you of it as a courtesy, as I owe you that. The transfer of documentation to the state's attorney's office will occur this afternoon, regardless of any action this board takes." She picked up her portfolio. In the back row, Raymond's attorney was speaking rapidly into his phone. Raymond himself had not moved. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man doing a very fast and very private recalculation. Gerald Marsh looked up from the report. His expression had changed into something she had not seen on his face before. Not approval, exactly, but something quieter and more permanent than the complex loyalty of a long professional relationship. He said her name. "I know," she said, and she walked out. Marcus testified over 4 sessions spanning 2 weeks. He sat in a conference room in the state's attorney's office on California Avenue and spoke carefully, in the fragmented but precise way that had become his method, acknowledging when memory was clear, acknowledging when it was not, and never filling gaps with inference. The prosecutors appreciated this. Defense attorneys would later find it very difficult to attack. He described refusing to sign the acceptance report. He described filing the internal concern and receiving the fraudulent third-party certification. He described calling Daniel Calloway on the night of the fire and why. He described the fire itself in the portions he could access: the heat, the sound, the door that would not open, and Daniel Calloway's hands on his jacket pulling him through it. He described Daniel handing him the necklace. He said, "Daniel told me there were 4 people in the inner bay. He said, 'Keep this.'" His voice was completely calm. Then he went back in. He paused, and the room was very still. "I have thought about that moment every day for 8 years. I do not think he made a calculation. I think he simply could not leave while they were still in there. I think that was just who he was." The documentary evidence did not require Marcus's testimony to be complete. The forged signature, the email chain, the materials invoices, the hospital intake record, and the backup server data formed a file that the defense would spend 8 months attempting to discredit without meaningful success. But Marcus's testimony was the part that the families of the other 7 victims came to hear. They sat in the gallery and listened to the one man who had been inside the tunnel tell them, with the careful honesty of someone who had carried it alone for too long, exactly what had happened to the people they had lost. Raymond Calloway was arrested 4 months after the shareholder meeting. He was charged with procurement fraud, obstruction of justice, and criminally negligent homicide. His trial lasted 11 weeks. He was convicted on the first 2 counts and acquitted on the third. The jury accepted that he had not known with certainty that the Class C material would fail catastrophically, only that it did not meet specification. He was sentenced to 6 years and served 4. Margaret was not charged criminally. The state's attorney's investigation concluded that her approval of the budget reduction, while negligent in its lack of oversight, did not meet the threshold for criminal liability given that the specific allocation had been made without her knowledge. She faced civil suits from 4 of the 8 victims' families. She settled all 4 at amounts her attorney considered excessive and she considered non-negotiable. She sold her personal equity stake in Calloway Urban Systems, a stake she had spent 30 years building to fund the settlements and ensure that the company's pension obligations to its employees were met in full before the restructuring. Calloway Urban Systems did not go bankrupt. A Chicago-based infrastructure firm acquired it 18 months after the shareholder meeting, retained the majority of the workforce, and removed the Calloway name from the company letterhead. Margaret did not object. She moved out of the Lincoln Park townhouse and into a smaller apartment in Andersonville. She did not give interviews. She did not write a book. She sat, twice a week, with a therapist she had resisted seeing for 8 years, and found, slowly and without resolution, that grief did not actually respond to discipline. Marcus Webb had his name back before the end of the first year. The process was bureaucratic and slow and required 4 separate hearings to establish legal identity for a person who had existed, for 8 years, as a gap in the administrative record. Claire Novak handled most of it as a courtesy, billing Margaret for expenses only. When it was done, Marcus held a valid Illinois identification card, a reinstated professional engineering license, and a credit history that began, effectively, at age 39. He did not return to private construction. He accepted a position as a safety inspector with an independent nonprofit that provided oversight auditing for city and county infrastructure projects, with a particular focus on communities where official scrutiny had historically been minimal. The organization was funded by a grant from a private foundation whose donor of record was listed as an anonymous individual trust. Margaret had established the trust 3 weeks before her resignation and structured it so that she had no ongoing control over the organization it funded. She did not tell Marcus. She thought, on balance, he would prefer not to know while he was still deciding what to do with the information of her existence in his life. He found out eventually, through a colleague who had done the incorporation paperwork. He did not call her. He sent a 1-line email. "I am going to do good work here." She read it in her Andersonville apartment at 7 in the morning, sitting at a kitchen table that was smaller than any table she had owned in 20 years, and she sat with it for a long time before replying. She wrote back, "I know you will." The memorial service was held on a Saturday in late November, 1 year after the shareholder meeting. It was not the first memorial for the East River Tunnel victims. There had been an official city ceremony 8 years prior, attended by officials and cameras, and attended by grief that had nowhere honest to go. This was different. It was organized by the families themselves, held at a community center in Woodlawn, and the only press present was a single reporter from a neighborhood paper who had covered the original fire as a young journalist and asked to attend as a private citizen. There were folding chairs arranged in a wide semicircle. Photographs of the 8 victims stood on a table at the front of the room. Work photographs, family photographs, one school picture of a man who had been 22 years old. Their families sat in the front rows. Their names were read aloud, one at a time, by the sister of a steelworker named James Okafor, who had died in Bay 9. Margaret arrived early and sat in the middle of the room, between a woman she did not know and an older man who turned out to be the father-in-law of another victim. She did not introduce herself as Margaret Calloway. She gave her first name when asked, and the man nodded, and they sat together in the ordinary way of people gathered for the same purpose. Marcus came in near the end of the opening remarks and stood at the back. He was wearing a dark gray jacket, well-fitted the jacket of a man who had recently been reintroduced to the simple logistics of owning things. He moved through the room without agenda, stopping to speak with James Okafor's sister, with the parents of a young electrician named Kevin Park, with 2 men Margaret did not recognize. He was present in the patient way of someone who understood that showing up was sometimes the only adequate offering. Eventually, he reached the row where Margaret was sitting. She looked up. He looked down at her without surprise. She thought he had probably known she was there from the moment he came in. He reached into the collar of his jacket and lifted the necklace over his head. He held it out to her. She looked at it. The small steel pendant, the engraved initial, the hairline fracture running from corner to corner. She had made that fracture 23 years ago and carried the guilt of it for a single afternoon before Daniel had said, "Mom, it is fine. I like it better this way. It means it is actually mine." She reached out and took it. She held it in her palm. Then she reached up and took Marcus's hand and folded his fingers back around the pendant, closing his fist over it. He looked at her. "Daniel gave it to the person who needed to be saved," she said. Her voice was low, meant only for him. "That was you. It was always you." She kept her hand over his closed fist for a moment. "Keep it." Marcus stood very still. Around them, the room continued its quiet movement, voices, chairs, the small sounds of people finding their way back toward each other across distances that loss had opened. He nodded, once, and put the necklace back on. Margaret sat with her hands in her lap. The man beside her, the father-in-law she had not known an hour ago, was telling her about his son-in-law's habit of bringing home whatever he found at job sites: screws, odd bits of pipe, a perfectly good wrench, because he could not stand the idea of useful things going to waste. She listened. She did not look at her phone. She did not think about what needed to happen next. For the first time in 8 years, there was nothing that needed to happen next. She was simply present, in a folding chair, in a room full of people who had loved someone and lost them and were learning, as she was learning, that those 2 facts did not cancel each other out, but existed together, permanently, the way a fracture exists in steel, visible, structural, and somehow part of what makes the thing